So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. Can you guys dim the lights? I need to say up front that this is a collective of works done by a variety of people, not just myself, and there's a large list of co-authors there, and I won't take time to go through them, but certainly this work was not all done by myself. So the context of what I want to talk to you about today is the emerging role of physics-based wildfire modeling and how it relates to where we might be able to go in the future. So this is a really important idea that was put out by a friend of mine, the late Sheldon Thiessen from Sandia National Labs, and he said something about modeling in general. He said, so observations or experiments are complete physics, but they're only partially disclosed. We only know part of what's going on there, even though it's the real physics. Models, on the other hand, are only partial physics, because we usually don't model all of it, but it's fully disclosed. We can tease out anything we want out of those models. And so to keep that in mind, and keep the way those two things can be partnered together, to me is a really key aspect of thinking about how we take models forward. So, is it possible to get the screen? No. Or just turn it, that's fine. So, the key here is that we're going to try to develop new understanding. We want to use these models to help think about new hypotheses or refine hypotheses, and to help with scenario explorations as we go forward. So, modeling wildfires, for those of you who haven't done a lot of it, there's a number of things that make it very, very difficult. First of all, you've got a huge range of length scales ranging from flame sheets up to atmospheric scales. And from a computational standpoint, that's really a rough thing to handle. You've got a complex set of phenomenology which interplay together, complex chemistry, multi-phase flow, turbulence, convective and radiative heat transfer, etc. You've got a complex set of environmental conditions. Okay, this isn't idealized scenarios. These are things where you have complex topography, complex weather scenarios, etc. In modeling these things, you've got to provide some kind of boundary and initial conditions, both for the fuel and for the atmosphere. This is a really hard problem also, because if you want to match it to experiments, you've got to get the details. So, the approach that we've taken and that some other teams have taken is basically to think about this as you're trying to capture a range or spectrum of phenomenology, some of which you can resolve explicitly using things like finite difference or finite volume methodologies in computational fluid dynamics, and some of which you can't. So an example of resolved phenomenology would be the wind flow over topography, for instance, or maybe the wind flow around trees. So some examples of things that are subdata or subgrid would be flow around individual branches or flow around pine needles, because you don't know where they are and you can't resolve them even if you knew where they were, if you want to do a landscape scale simulation. So the other thing to recognize is the fact that you don't have the temperature distribution at every single point if you're looking at a landscape. So you've got some subgrid temperature distribution which you have to at least account for. And there's different methodologies for doing that, but you have to deal with subgrid things. Another classical one is turbulence. Turbulence is happening around over hills, it's happening around trees, and it's happening at the flame sheet level. Some of it's resolved and some of it's not resolved. So I'm going to go through a set of examples now just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that are starting to be explored with these kinds of models and where we see the future being. So you can explore anticipated events. There's been a lot of bark beetle-induced mortality in the forests in the West in the past decade. And so there's a lot of people that have become worried about what does that mean for fire behavior. Will it become worse? Will it become less severe, etc.? So we can think of bark beetles, but we can think of that in terms of drought. We could think of that in terms of of other kinds of changes, succession, et cetera. How does fire change in some future set of scenarios? So we've done a set of explorations here, and we've accounted for, in this case, we had a series of years after an insect attack where there was some amount of mortality that was caused initially, and it spread. So in this case, it was a broad attack. Okay, a lot of the trees got infected or got killed in the first year, and so this is a series where the trees, they dry, they start to lose they turn brown, their moisture drops, and then they lose their needles by the end. So we can look at, as a function of time, how does the fire behavior change in this context. So this is done in a coupled fire atmosphere model, which means that the winds are being predicted or simulated through this canopy. And so as the canopy changes, the fire reacts differently to both the airflow and the presence of fuel. So this was a case where the insects killed a broad spectrum of trees all at once. There's also a scenario, and the exact scenario here was developed by my colleague Russ Parsons, but there's also a scenario where an insect attack might get in and start with small nuclei of trees, and then with successive years, that nuclei, the range of the mortality starts to grow, and so you get these patches. So you get a different kind of evolution of the forest over time. So here you have drying and patchy frameworks, and you can see certainly that the duration to get to mortality of the overall forest is much longer, but you also have a different thing now because you don't turn all of the needles on all of the trees red or dry at the same time. Instead, you start to lose needles. That fragments the forest, that fragments the canopy, which makes it so that it can't carry a crown fire, so it changes the dynamics. So if we think about what does this do to spread rate, and I'm not really trying to convey the details of here, I'm just trying to convey what kinds of things can we explore. If we look at the different modes of insect attack, where it's this broad spectrum mortality event or this patchy growth mortality event, we get different kinds of things happening. Okay, so in this picture, what we see is that the spread rates, they happen at different times with respect to moisture. So in the case where you have a broad attack, you have all the needles on the tree being red at the same time, and that produces, but all the needles are still on the tree, that produces your peak spread rates. Whereas when you have the heterogeneous mortality rates, you end up with a scenario where your peak spread rates happen when there's only been a little bit of average moisture drop, because after that you start losing needles from the trees and you can't support a crown fire anymore. So if we're going to say what does fire do to under the situation where we've had these mortality events, we need to know a little bit more about the nature of the mortality events. So I just mentioned that moisture acts differently in these different cases, but the net effect of losing canopy material has a similar effect in both cases. So being able to contrast cause and effect relationships allows us to think about creating response surfaces like the one here produced by Chad Hoffman. So keep in mind that these physics-based models produce simulated events, and we're able to back up and look at the cause and effect relationships of the simulated fire behavior. That's not real fire behavior, that's simulated fire behavior. From that, we can create the response surfaces, but what's really important is that we constantly keep trying to tie these back to reality and think about what do observations show, when is the model performing well and when is the model not performing well. Unfortunately, that's not always very easy because the data available for direct comparison is very sparse. So another thing that's being explored right now is the use of these kinds of models to look at risk evaluation, different than what we heard in the previous talk, but risk evaluation for, say, critical facilities. And so in the top, you've got a simulation where a fire was started from a hypothesized front, moving at a critical facility on the left, and it behaves in such a way that it moves both severe fire and a lot of spotting. The white dots that are showing up, those are landed firebrands. In the bottom, what's been done is that the scenario was managed by just removing some of the fuel in the bottom of that canyon. And it had a lot of impact on the way the fire was able to creep down the canyon, cross the canyon bottom, and come back out. It didn't stop all of the fire because you still had firebrands that were landing on the other side that could start new fires and go on, but it slowed down and managed the head fire. So, these are a set of old simulations, but I really like to point these out because these are grass fires. These are about the simplest kind of fire that anybody ever comes up with. Oh, it's just a grass fire. Here's two grass fires where fires were lit with the only difference in the two simulations was the length of the line that you start with. Okay? And yet, that is still a big unknown. For a simple grass fire with a homogeneous, idealized wind condition, you get different fire behavior depending on the length of the line or the shape of the line. If we can't get that right, we've got a problem when we start going to more complex scenarios. So the good thing about these models is that we can dissect them and look at that fully disclosed, partial physics, but fully disclosed nature of the results. In this case, we can look at the fire lines of two different lengths and start to understand what drives their different behavior. So in this case, we've got pressure is the red and blue, and the white lines are 2D streamlines along the surface. And so what we can understand here is there's a combination of a pressure differential across the fire line and a combination of competition between the flank fires and the head fires that drive this difference between the different lengths of fires. Now the job is to parameterize that and move forward. Another key thing is to think about, if you look at a fire line, it's not just a wall of fire. It has these vertical, three-dimensional vertical pattern to it. And so what is the impact of that? And so this shows up in the field, just as one of the photographs on the previous slide, as well as in the lab. And so the picture on the upper left is in Missoula at the fire lab. It was some experiments that Mark Finney was leading. And on the right is a set of simulation results where we can get in there and dissect. They were at different scales because one was a laboratory fire and one was a grass fire. But we can get in there and see that the three-dimensionality of that fire front has a lot to do with how does it behave. And a lot to do with how you get heat to the unburned fuel in front of the fire. So, one of the key things about these models, because they are fully disclosed, is we can back up and look at the big picture, and we can look at different parts of the picture that you can't always do when you're dealing with experiments. So you go out there with your experiments, and you put your towers out, you put them in front of a fire, and you expect to get events A, B, or C. Well, if we watch this, the colors that are going to show up in the vector field, those are velocities in and out of the screen. So what I want you to think about is some instruments lined up where that, and those are in the plane of the white line. Think about some instruments on that plane, and think about what you're going to measure, and how do you put that in a context that is meaningful for the whole fire line. There's a heck of a lot of heterogeneity going on if you were to measure those winds. A single measurement can be very, very misleading. So one thing you could do with the models is back up and say, well, I took this measurement, how representative is that likely to be of the overall fire line? How much heterogeneity is there? So another thing that's going on is we're trying to push forward and think about events such as the Los Conchas fires. So the perimeters there, the orange perimeter was at 8 p.m. By 3 a.m., the perimeter was where the red line is. That jumped from 8,000 to 43,000 acres. So one of the questions is, why is that happening? There's two hypotheses that are out there right now. One is that somehow you lose support for your heavily soot-laden column, and it creates a density current which pushes the fire, increases the winds at the surface, and pushes your fire along. The other idea that's currently being investigated is the fact that this was on the downslope of a mountain. So what could be happening? This was overnight that it went from 8,000 to 43,000 acres. What could be happening when you start to watch the interplay between mountain waves coming over the hill and the fire plume itself? And that's it.
Thank you. So we still have a little bit of time for maybe one question.
Go for it.
So how complex was the vegetation inputs in the model that you're using? Just chemical density?
So these are three-dimensionally resolved fuel beds, which at let's say approximately the meter scale. So what you're doing is you're filling cells so to build, so you can have a surface layer, and then you could have a stem space, and then you could have a canopy. You can have, here's a tree that's resolved in these volumes and a space and another set of trees. So you've got to have, so in theory, you're specifying here's a density within this 2 by 2 by 2 or 1 by 1 by 1 meter cell at any given location. So if all you had was average canopy bulk density, then you have to make a decision, is it relatively closed canopy or is it relatively open, in which case you're best off thinking about in terms of mean diameters of trees and what's an average tree look like, or a distribution of trees. Most of the stuff we do is with a distribution of trees.